Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. The Organic Man Coffee Trike is still running that special. You give them a handful of money and they will give you the best coffee in the world. Okay, maybe that's not really a special. That's kind of how things are done, but it will make your life much better. Swing by 4501 McPherson between 6:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. and find the best coffee you've ever had. If you're not in Laredo for some mysterious reason, you can visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Don't drink bad coffee. It'll make your life not that good. Seeing as it's Halloween, well, almost Halloween, in my book it's already here. Seeing as it's the best month of the year, when all the cool shows are on TV and all the good movies are on, I thought I'd do something special for somebody that is always associated with Halloween, and yet he probably had very little to do with it originally. I have a poem stuck in my head. It goes like this. Once upon a Brugladite, his tony nails a clawing, a handsome ugwump came my way. I knew he was a darling. This was a Lay's potato chip commercial from way back when I was about 10 years old. I have the whole poem stuck in my head. If you bought a bag of potato chips, inside would be a small rubber toy. It kind of looked like a monster. You could stick it on the end of your finger and wiggle it back and forth like a little monster. The idea was you were supposed to collect the whole bunch. Now, I think I had two or three. Nobody I knew had the entire set. Once upon a midnight dreary. Now that's a poem that most people recognize. If you go back and listen or read all the words, it's a very depressing story. I'll get into it more later on in the show. Edgar Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts, January 19th, 1809. He was the second child of American actor David Poe Jr. and English actress Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. He had an elder brother named Henry and a younger sister named Rosalie. Their grandfather, David Poe, had immigrated from County Cavan, Ireland, back in 1750. His father abandoned the family in 1810, and his mother died a year later from tuberculosis. And at that time, they called it consumption because it looked like your body was being consumed from within. Poe was sent to live in a home of John Allen in Richmond, Virginia. Allen was a successful merchant who dealt in cloth, wheat, tombstones, tobacco, and slaves. The Allens served as a foster family and gave him the name Edgar Allan Poe, although Edgar was never actually adopted by the family. The Allen family moved to the United Kingdom in 1815, and so Poe went to school in Ayrshire, Scotland. Well, then the family moved to London the next year. This moving around gave Poe a lot of different experiences, but it made it very difficult to accumulate close friends. The Allens moved back to Richmond in 1820. In 1824, Poe served as the lieutenant of the Richmond Youth Honor Guard when the Marquis de Lafayette was visiting the city. 1825, Allen's uncle, William Galt, died, leaving Allen several acres of land with a value today of about $19 million. Allen bought a two-story house that he named Moldavia. Back then, rich folks named their homes and their property. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was to show the less fortunate folks what it was like when you owned everything. 1826, Poe enrolled in the University of Virginia. He was there to study ancient and modern language. The university had been founded by Thomas Jefferson. It had strict rules against gambling and horses and guns and tobacco. Oh, and also alcohol. You weren't supposed to use any of those things. They also enacted a system of student self government, allowing the students to choose their own studies. Also, they had to make their own arrangements for living. They were supposed to report all wrongdoings to the facility. This unique system was just getting underway and it was in chaos. There were a high dropout rate. Poe became estranged from his foster father over gambling debts. The school did have rules against gambling, but nobody ever bothered to enforce them. Poe asked Allen for more money to pay for school and all the things needed, things like food and clothing. Whenever Poe did receive money, he used it to gamble instead of towards his education. After a year of this lifestyle, Poe decided to drop out, but he didn't want to return to Richmond. His sweetheart had married somebody else, and his stepdad was somewhat, well, no, he was a whole lot upset with him. 1827, Poe moved to Boston. He took on small jobs working as a clerk or as a newspaper reporter, whatever he could do to make a few bucks. He began using the name Henry Le Renette. Finding it difficult to make a living writing and not getting anything from his stepdad, Poe enlisted as a private in the U.S. Army. He enlisted May 26, 1827, with a 5-year enlistment. He entered under an assumed name once again, going by Edgar A. Perry, and he lied about his age, saying that he was 22 when he was only 18. He was assigned to Battery H of the 1st Artillery at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. October 31st, yes, on Halloween, but it wasn't Halloween at the time, Battery H was ordered to Fort Moultrie in order to protect the Charleston Harbor. Now, the United States wasn't at war with anybody that year. The closest thing going was the Winnebago Uprising. This was a brief conflict that took place in the upper Mississippi River region of the United States, mostly in what is now Wisconsin. The hostilities were limited to a few attacks on civilians by a portion of the Winnebago tribe. Now they're better known as the Ho Chunk Indians. The Ho Chunks were reacting to a wave of lead miners who were trespassing on their land, and they were also responding to rumors that the United States had sent two of their tribe to a rival tribe for execution. Have you ever wondered why the badger is the U of W's mascot? They don't have badgers in that area. Lead miners would build small caves to live in along the riverbanks as they panned for lead or mined for lead. People said that these miners were acting like badgers, and that's where they got the mascot. Poe had made arrangements for his first book of poetry to be published while he was away in the military. As an enlisted man, he found himself among immigrants and displaced unskilled laborers, plus a fair share of America's ne'er do wells, petty criminals, drunkards, bankrupt folks, and mostly a bunch of illiterates. At Fort Moultrie, Poe was promoted to artificer, which is a non commissioned officer or enlisted man who had a mechanical specialty, kind of like a Spec 4 in the military today. Being able to read and write gave him a leg up on all of his fellow soldiers. December 11th, 1828, Poe's battery sailed for Fort Monroe, Virginia, where he attained the rank of sergeant major. This was the highest possible rank a non commissioned officer could get. His quick progress up the ranks can be attributed to his education, high social standards, and his competence. Poe was finding life in the enlisted ranks somewhat undesirable. Fraternizing with officers was not allowed. So Poe was stuck trying to carry on intelligent conversations with men that didn't read or write and had no use for far flung ideas like literature or philosophy. In 1828, he revealed his real name and his circumstances to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Howard. Howard said that he would allow Poe to leave the army if he reconciled with his stepdad, Allan, and he found somebody to take his place. Poe wrote a letter to Allan, who was very unsympathetic, and he spent several months ignoring Poe. I could only find reference to substitute soldiers during the Civil War. The idea was if a person had money, they could pay somebody to take their place and fill any outstanding military obligation. The substitute was only filling a slot occupied by the person who wanted out. It was just a number on a page. Poe didn't have the money to pay for a substitute, but his stepdad did. When Poe's stepmother finally died in February 1829, Allen decided that he would buy Poe out of his enlistment. His time in the army gave Poe a lot of fuel, ideas for characters who he would write about in future books. It also gave him time to think of ways to express his ideas so that folks would listen and like his writings. Now, Poe wasn't trying to get out of the military entirely. He was trying to get out of the enlisted ranks. Poe set his sights on West Point as soon as he was discharged. As a part of his application process, he solicited and obtained endorsements of former commanding officers, and he also augmented this with testimonials of others of important rank and political influence. Before entering West Point, Poe lived in Baltimore with his widowed aunt, Maria Clem, her daughter Virginia Eliza Clem, his brother Henry, and his grandmother Elizabeth Carnes Poe. In September of that year, Poe received a review of his poetry by an influential critic, John Neal. Poe considered himself to be a successful poet at last. He said, "This was the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard." Poe traveled to West Point and entered as a cadet on July 1st, 1830. In October, Allen married his second wife, Louisa Patterson. The marriage and bitter quarrels with Poe over children that were born to Allen out of extramarital affairs led to his foster father disowning Poe. Perhaps Poe shouldn't have referred to him as a drunken womanizer. And he put that down in writing to a letter to his stepdad. While at West Point, Poe was known for sneaking off the base and drinking in town. A lot. He also committed many minor infractions of the rules. Some folks would say he was a disgrace to the uniform. Well, just about every cadet was doing things like this, or even worse. Poe was in the top 10% of his class. He knew all about drill and ceremony from his time as an enlisted man. He was able to speak several languages, and this put him ahead of the others when it came to reading military maneuvers that were used in other countries. A lot of the American military doctrine came from the French army because they helped out during the Revolutionary War. So, whenever a lot of texts had been written in French, well, Poe could read them, whereas these other guys, they had to get somebody to translate for them. He was actually doing quite well as a cadet, but his stepfather's actions began to drive Poe into a depressed state. One night, after a lot of consumption of bottled spirits, Poe ran into the barracks, throwing a bloody pillowcase with something about the size and shape of a human head onto the floor and waving a bloody knife in the air. Poe announced that he had just killed their most disliked cadre officer. The other cadets were horrified, not wanting to look at or get too close to this pillowcase. Well, it turned out that it contained a dead goose. Months after Allen disowned him, Poe decided that he was going to leave West Point by purposely getting court-martialed. He stopped showing up for class, he missed drill and ceremony, he skipped church services. The grand act of disobedience was when ordered to appear on the parade ground with his PBS, that's his pistol belt and stuff. Poe showed up with his crossed bandoliers, his rifle, his hat, his boots, his gloves, but not his uniform. He stood there without any clothes on, just his gear. Well, he was ordered to show up with his gear. On February 8, 1831, he was tried for gross negligence of duty and disobeying orders. He pled not guilty to induce a dismissal, knowing that he would be found guilty. Well, Poe was kicked out of West Point. He left for New York February 1831, and he released a third volume of poems simply titled Poems. The book had been financed with the help of his fellow cadets at West Point, who had each donated 75 cents towards the cause. Poe was able to raise $170, 75 cents at a time. Poe returned to his aunt's house, where his brother was in the process of drinking himself to death. His brother died in August. After his early attempts at poetry, Poe turned his attention to prose, the ordinary language that people use in speaking or writing. A literary medium distinguished from poetry by its greater irregularity and variety of rhythm and its closer correspondence to the patterns of everyday speech. It's what most books are written in today. Poe placed a few stories with a Philadelphia publication and began working on his only drama called Politian. Politian is a play written by Poe in 1835, but he never finished it. The play was a fictionalized version of a true event that took place in Kentucky, the murder of Solomon P. Sharp, which happened in 1825. The so-called Kentucky tragedy made national headlines and attracted a lot of fictional representations. Poe chose to set his version in 16th century Rome. The Baltimore Saturday Visitor awarded him a prize in October 1833 for his short story, MS Found in a Bottle. The plot follows an unnamed narrator at sea who finds himself in a series of harrowing circumstances. The story brought him to the attention of John P. Kennedy, a man of considerable means, who helped Poe place some of his stories and introduced him to Thomas White, editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. In 1835, Poe became assistant editor of the paper, but he got fired within a couple of weeks for drinking on the job. Poe had very little tolerance for alcohol. One drink would kind of make him drunk, and two would literally knock him off his feet. A lot of people would consume alcohol during lunch breaks. A few even had it with their breakfast. Having a brother who died from drinking should have been motivation for Poe to not go down that path. But people didn't consider drinking to be a problem. It was blamed on a lack of constitution. Weak people died from drinking. Everybody else just drank themselves half to death. Poe was living in his aunt's house along with his cousin. They would talk and they would walk around town looking at things of interest. Poe would tell his cousin about things from all over the world that he'd read about while working at the newspaper or the magazine office. After his brother's death, Poe began more earnest attempts to start his career as a writer, but he chose a difficult time in American publishing. He was one of the first Americans to live strictly on what he made by writing. Most writers at the time had a job and then they wrote as a hobby or as a sideline, but Poe was trying to live strictly off of writing. When he set out on this course, the country was going into a depression, something called the Panic of 1837. And there were dozens of publishers that were coming forth with books that were written in England, but they didn't bother to pay copyright. There was no international copyright law. So if a publisher wanted to print a book, well, he just did. And they didn't want to use American writers because then they would have to pay them. So they would just steal books from England, republish them, and sell those. The Panic of 1837 got started because President Andrew Jackson hated international banks and he had little confidence in paper money. He wanted to deal strictly in gold or silver. The national debt got paid off, first and last time ever in the history of our country. The economy was booming. Lots of bad loans were then made by bankers, and the price of cotton and other exports began to plummet. Things got shaky, and it led to a national depression that lasted for 3 years. There is some speculation that the bankers did this on purpose because of Andrew Jackson's policies towards them, but like I said, that's just a rumor. There was a booming growth in American periodicals at the time as well. People would create magazines about all kinds of things. Most would print one or two issues and then they'd close their doors. Writers were often paid months after their articles were published. The owners of these magazines sometimes never even bothered to pay these people because they would make a few bucks printing a few magazines and then go broke, at least on paper. Poe had to demand or beg his publishers to pay him what he had been promised. Poe was reinstated by White after promising to behave himself. and he returned to Richmond with Virginia and her mother. He remained at the Messenger until January 1837. Poe said that their circulation increased from 700 magazines a month to 3,500, and he took credit for that. He also published several poems, book reviews, critiques, and stories while at the paper. Things were different back then. Men dressed in suits and ties. Women wore long dresses. Men would hold the door open for women. And on occasion, people would marry their own relatives, kind of like how the royalty does today. May 16th, 1836, Poe and Virginia held a Presbyterian wedding ceremony at the Richmond boarding house, with a witness falsely attesting that Clem was actually 21 years old. Just like Jerry Lee Lewis, Poe married his own cousin, who was 13 at the time. Poe was 26, unlike Lewis, who was 22. It boggles the mind today. How could this be allowed? Back in the 1800s, people weren't expected to live all that long. The average life expectancy was 37 years, half of what it is today. 13 then would be about 20 years today. Few people married at such a young age, even then. The average age of a woman who got married at that time was 20, and the average age of a man was 26. Well, Poe was the right age, but his sweetie was a bit, well, no, she was a whole lot too young. Are we going to condemn him for this? It's one of those things best left for other people to worry about. In the 1600s, she would have been the proper age for getting married. Maybe they were just a couple of hundred years late. 1838, Poe relocated to Philadelphia, where he lived at four different residences between 1838 and 1844, one of which was 532 North 7th Street, which has been preserved as a national landmark today. That same year, Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, was published. That name is just too long. Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. I would have made it a lot shorter, easier to say. In the summer of 1839, he became assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. He published numerous articles, stories, and reviews, enhancing his reputation as a critic, which he had established at the Messenger. Also in 1839, the collection Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque was published in 2 volumes, though he made little money from it, and it did kind of receive mixed reviews. June 1840, Poe published a prospectus announcing his intentions to start his own magazine called The Stylus, although he originally was going to call it The Pen because it was going to be based out of Philadelphia. He bought advertising space in other magazines, and he told people that this was going to be a monthly literary journal that would be edited and published in Philadelphia. The journal was never produced before Poe died. Poe left Burton's after about a year and found a position as a writer and co-editor at Graham's Magazine, a successful monthly publication. Now I have to speculate, this is just my thoughts on the subject. Did Poe move from house to house and from job to job because when he was quite young, his family moved around the countryside a lot? It was like a habit that was instilled in him that he just could never break. It's just a thought. Poe had a keen interest in cryptography or codes. He placed a notice of his abilities in the Philadelphia paper Alexander's Weekly Messenger. Like I said, there were lots of magazines at the time, inviting submissions of ciphers which he would then solve. July 1841, Poe had published an essay called A Few Words on Secret Writing in Graham's Magazine. He was capitalizing on public interest in the topic, and he wrote The Gold Bug, incorporating ciphers as an essential part of the story. Many people today believe that Poe was the originator of the Beale ciphers, based on the book The Gold Bug. Poe's success with cryptography relied not so much on his deep knowledge of the field as on his knowledge of the magazines and newspapers' culture. His keen analytical ability allowed him to see that the general public was largely ignorant of the method by which a simple substitution cryptogram could be solved, and he used this to his advantage. The sensation that Poe created with his cryptography stunts played a major role in popularizing cryptograms in newspapers and magazines. Two of the ciphers that he published in 1841 under the name W.B. Tyler were not solved until 1992 and 2000, respectively. One was a quote from Joseph Addison's play Cato, and the other is based on a poem by Hester Thrall. Poe had an influence on cryptography beyond increasing public interest during his time. William Friedman, America's foremost cryptologist, was heavily influenced by Poe. Friedman's initial interest in cryptography came from when he read The Gold Bug as a child, and an interest that he later put to use in deciphering Japan's Purple Code during World War II. This was one of the many reasons that the United States won the war. So we can thank Edgar Allan Poe for winning the war against Japan. One evening, January 1842, Virginia showed the first signs of consumption or tuberculosis. While singing and playing the piano, she began to cough. Uh, she did recover from this. She's coughed up some blood, actually. She only partially recovered, and Poe began to drink more heavily under the stress of her illness. He left Graham's and attempted to find a new position, trying for a government post. He returned to New York, where he worked briefly at the Evening Mirror before becoming editor of the Broadway Journal, which he later bought. Around this time, Poe attempted to secure a position in the administration of John Tyler, claiming that he was a member of the Whig Party. He hoped to be appointed to the United States Customs House in Philadelphia. He was banking on help from the President Tyler's son, Robert, who was an acquaintance of Poe's friend, Frederick Thomas. He was a friend of a friend. A friend of a friend sent me to get this job. Poe failed to show up for his meeting with Thomas, claiming that he had been sick, but Thomas was under the impression that Poe might have been drunk. Poe was promised a position, but when he finally discovered that all the positions had been filled by other people, Poe alienated himself from other writers by publicly accusing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism. Longfellow never responded to any of these accusations. Charles Dickens, one of the Victorian era novelists, wrote Barnaby Rudge in 1841. The story's title character was accompanied by a feathered companion who was able to speak. Poe reviewed the first few chapters of the book in Graham's magazine. When Dickens visited the U.S., he met with Poe, and he brought with him Grip, his pet raven, and this was the inspiration behind Rudge's peculiar companion. January 29th, 1845, Poe wrote the poem The Raven, and it appeared in the Evening Mirror and became a popular sensation. It made Poe a household name almost instantly, although he was only paid $9 for his poem. Once Upon a Midnight Dreary, that one. Poe was delighted to learn of the unique specimen's real life sentience. Grip's impression upon him was so profound that Poe adopted elements of his character into his own work, The Raven. The Raven is a poem about a man who is heartbroken over the recent death of his beloved Lenore. As he passes a lonely December night in his room. Now, Virginia was still alive at the time, but her death was a given since she had contracted a disease that nobody ever survived from. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if some one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more." I'm not going to read the entire poem. It's quite long, and I don't really have the voice for it. You can listen to the entire poem just by searching The Raven, and there are a lot of people out there that read it. Christopher Lee, a famous horror actor, he does quite a good job of reading The Raven. Poe stated that the raven itself was a symbol of grief, specifically that it represented mournful and never ending remembrance. Poe said he hoped this poem would make him famous. Well, it did. Everybody knows the words of at least the beginning. The trouble is, a lot of people don't know who wrote the poem. The Broadway Journal failed in 1846, and Poe moved into a cottage in Fordham, New York. That home is now known as the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage, was relocated in later years to a park near the southeast corner of Grand Concourse and the Kingsbridge Road. Virginia died in the cottage January 30th, 1847. Biographers and critics often suggest that Poe's frequent theme of the death of a beautiful woman stems from his repeated loss of women throughout his life, including his mother and his wife. Try reading The Fall of the House of Usher. I did, and it still pops into my head from time to time. It's one of those kind of stories. You read it one time, you don't ever have to read it again because you can't get it out of your mind. Poe became increasingly unstable after his wife's death. He did attempt to court Sarah Helen Whitman. Their engagement failed because Poe was drinking a lot and acting up. There's also strong evidence that Whitman's mother intervened and did much to derail the relationship. Poe then returned to Richmond and he resumed a relationship with his childhood sweetheart, the one that had married someone else. I guess her husband died or left her or some such. Poe wrote a book called Eureka in 1848, which includes cosmological theory that presaged the Big Bang Theory by 80 years. He also came up with a plausible solution to Olber's paradox, also known as the dark night sky paradox. Astrophysics and physical cosmology says the darkness of the night sky conflicts with the assumption of an infinite and eternal static universe. The sky should be gray and not black since there are so many stars out there. Poe didn't use any kind of a scientific method in writing Eureka. Instead, he went by intuition. He considered it a work of art, not science, but insisted that it was still true, and he considered this to be one of his career masterpieces. Now, Eureka is full of a lot of scientific errors. In particular, Poe's suggestions ignored Newtonian principles regarding the density and the rotation of planets. Well, Poe didn't own a white lab coat, and he never wore one. Yet he was able to conceive of the possible beginning of everything. He put forth the idea if the stars are far enough away, then it would take many thousands or millions of years for their rays to travel to Earth. Many stars are young enough and significantly remote that their light hasn't had a chance to reach us yet. This was Poe's answer to why the night sky was black instead of gray. The light just hasn't got here yet. Poe left his home in Richmond, Virginia in September 27, 1849, en route to Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems for a friend of his. He was taking the train because that's how you got from town to town back then. You could ride a horse or drive a wagon, but by the time you arrived, you're going to need a chiropractor, and they hadn't been invented yet. On October 3rd, he was found semi-conscious and incoherent outside a public house in Baltimore. It was later revealed that Poe had never made it to Philadelphia and that nobody had seen him the last 6 days. He got on a train heading somewhere else and simply disappeared. When he was found wandering outside a local pub, Poe was wearing heavily soiled, shabby clothing that was not his own. They didn't fit, and they were a style that he didn't wear. Now, he was not a rich man, but he still dressed well. The man who found him, a local typesetter for the Baltimore Sun, said that Poe was coherent only long enough to provide the name Joseph Snodgrass, who was an editor friend of Poe's. For 4 days, Poe was racked with fevered dreams and hallucinations. He called out repeatedly for somebody named Reynolds, although none of Poe's family or friends knew anybody by that name. Historians have been unable to identify anyone named Reynolds in any of Poe's entire life. He also made references to his wife in Richmond, although Virginia had died a year before and he wasn't married to anybody else yet. Eventually, October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe succumbed to his affliction. His official cause of death was initially listed as phrenitis, or swelling of the brain. The records have since disappeared, and many doubts of their accuracy are around today. Newspapers at the time reported Poe's death as congestion of the brain. Boy, some of these terms congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, which was a euphemism for death from disreputable causes such as drinking too much. The actual cause of death remains a mystery even today. Speculation has included everything from delirium tremens, heart disease, epilepsy, syphilis, meningital inflammation, cholera, carbon monoxide poisoning, and even rabies. One theory dated from 1872 suggested that Poe's death was caused by cooping, which was a form of electoral fraud in which citizens were forced to vote for a particular candidate, which sometimes would lead to violence or even death. Immediately after Poe's death, his literary rival, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, wrote a highly slanted profile obituary under the pseudonym filed with falsehoods that cast Poe as a lunatic. The long obituary appeared in the New York Tribune, signed Ludwig, on the day of Poe's burial in Baltimore. It was published throughout the country. The obituary began, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will grieve by it. Ludwig was soon identified as being Griswold, an editor, critic, and anthologist who had borne a grudge against Poe since 1842. Griswold had somehow become Poe's literary executor and attempted to destroy his enemy's reputation after his death. Most stories of Edgar Allan Poe being a constant drunk and drug addict came about because of Griswold. Griswold wrote a biographical article of Poe called Memoirs of the Author, which he included in an 1850 volume of his collected works. He depicted Poe as a depraved, drunken, drug-addled madman. Many of his claims were either lies or distortions. Griswold's book was denounced by those that knew Poe, including John Neal, who published an article defending Poe and attacking Griswold as a Rhadamanthus, who is not to be bilked of his fee, a thimble full of newspaper notoriety. Rhadamanthus was the judge of the underworld in Greek mythology. Griswold's book, nevertheless, became a popularly accepted biographical source. This was in part because it was the only full biography available, and it was reprinted a lot. In part because the readers were thrilled at the thought of reading works by an evil man. Letters to Griswold, represented as proof, were later revealed to be forgeries. Griswold had published a book that he claimed was the ultimate work in the world. Poe read this book and then wrote about all the works that should have been included and why several should have been left out. Griswold was incensed and began looking for some way to get even with Poe. Once Poe was no longer around to defend himself, Griswold went to town trying to turn the world against his nemesis. Poe's best-known fictional works were Gothic horror, adhering to the genre's conventions to appeal to public taste. This was long before Bram Stoker had written his classic novel, Dracula, in 1897. Many of Poe's works are generally considered a part of the dark romantic genre, a literary reaction to transcendentalism, which Poe strongly disliked. Horror author and historian H.P. Lovecraft was heavily influenced by Poe's horror tales. He dedicated an entire section of his long essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, to Poe's influence. In his letters, Lovecraft described Poe as his god of fiction. Lovecraft's earlier stories expressed a significant influence from Poe. A later work, At the Mountains of Madness, he quotes him and was influenced by the narratives of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, that book with a really weird name. Lovecraft also made extensive use of Poe's unity of effect in his fiction. Alfred Hitchcock once said, It's because I liked Edgar Allan Poe's stories so much that I began to make suspense films. Hitchcock made a lot of movies with twists and turns that nobody would expect. He was the guy that came out with a Psycho and The Birds. He made taking a shower a lot more adventurous and walking around outside scary. Hitchcock would appear in the background of each of his films, like how M. Night Shyamalan shows up in his films. Hitchcock started it. Beyond horror, Poe also wrote satires and humor. He used irony and ludicrous extravagance, often in an attempt to liberate the reader from cultural conformity. Metzengerstein is the first story that Poe is known to have published and his first foray into horror, but it was originally intended to be a satirization of the popular genre. It was supposed to have been funny, not scary. Poe was known as a writer of science fiction and became one of the first American authors in the 19th century to become more popular in Europe than in the United States. Poe is particularly respected in France, in part due to early translations by Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire's translations became definitive renditions of Poe's works in continental Europe. Jules Verne, the French author, was a lifelong fan of Edgar Allan Poe and had read his works as a boy. Poe's writings influenced Verne's own, taking in a mix of real world and the fantastic. In particular, Poe's 1840 story, The Balloon Hoax, caught Verne's attention. His story, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, was published and became an immediate success. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, written by Verne, was first published in France in 1869 and 70. It came out as short stories that you had to read each week. It is perhaps the most popular book of his science fiction series. Verne also wrote a sequel to Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, that he called an Antarctic mystery. Why the heck couldn't he have just called it Gordon Pym? Poe's work also influenced science fiction author H.G. Wells. If you don't recognize the name, there's no hope for you. Okay, maybe not really, but people just don't read the old books anymore. If you haven't read War of the Worlds, you should give it a shot. Or if you haven't heard Orson Welles' dramatized radio show from October 31st, 1938. Uh, just a word on reading War of the Worlds. You have to keep in mind World War I hadn't happened yet when War of the Worlds was written. Uh, you have to use your imagination a lot, and there were no modern technology to be used. It was all riding on horses and shooting cannons. The Guardian cited Pym as one of the greatest novels ever written in the English language and notes its influence on later authors such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Henry James, B. Traven, and David Morrell. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was, was written in 1838 and is the only complete novel by Poe. The work relates a tale of a young man who stows away aboard a whaling ship called the Grampus. Various adventures and misadventures befall Pym, including shipwrecks, mutiny, and cannibalism, before he is saved by the crew of the Jane Guy. Now, aboard this vessel, Pym and a sailor named Dirk Peters continue their adventures farther south. Poe's detective fiction tales feature C. Auguste Dupin, which laid the groundwork for all future detective novels. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said, Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from which the entire literature has developed. The mystery writers of America have named their award for excellence in the genre as the Edgars. C. Auguste Dupin was a fictional character created by Poe. Dupin made his first appearance in Poe's 1841 short story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely considered the first fictional detective story. Dupin also appears in The Mystery of the Marie Roget in 1842 and The Purloined Letter, which came out 1844. Stories before Poe invented the detective story, also known as whodunits, usually started out slow and they built up to a massive bloodbath. Well, kind of. A massive for the time. Nothing like what you can find today. Poe starts right out the gate with a scene of a bloody murder. Then the hero had to examine all the details and figure out who the culprit might be. Dupin is not a professional detective, and his motivations for solving mysteries change from story to story. Using what Poe termed ratiocination, Dupin combines his considerable intellect with creative imagination, even putting himself in the mind of the criminal. His talents are strong enough that he appears able to read the mind of his companion, the unknown narrator of all three stories. This would have been the Dr. Watson of the Sherlock Holmes stories, except he never got a name. Poe created the Dupin character before the word detective had even been coined. The character laid the groundwork for fictional detectives to come, including Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and Hercule Poirot by Agatha Christie. Poe wrote much of his work using themes aimed at mass marketing tastes. He was trying to find what was popular so it would sell. Poe was relying on his books and his stories to put food on the table. To that end, his fiction often included elements of popular pseudoscience, such as phrenology and physiognomy. Phrenology was a concept that caught on where the boys in the white lab coats had discovered that you could figure out who might be a criminal by mapping the lumps and bumps on their skull. Crimes were solved not by looking for clues as to who done it, but by feeling the suspect's skull and comparing it to official charts. You can find phrenology charts even today. Physiognomy was using a person's facial features or expressions, especially when regarding as indicative of character or ethnic origins. If a person looked like a criminal, they were guilty. Poe disliked didactism, a philosophy that emphasized instructional and informative qualities in literature, art, and design. He also didn't much care for allegory, a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal hidden meaning, typically or moral or political, although he believed that meaning in literature should be an undercurrent just beneath the surface. During his lifetime, Poe was mostly recognized as a literary critic. Fellow critics James Russell Lowell called him the most discriminating, philosophical, and fearless critic upon imaginative works who has written in America. Poe's caustic reviews earned him the reputation as being the tomahawk man. A favorite target of Poe's criticism was Boston's acclaimed poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was often defended by his literary friends in what was later called the Longfellow War. Poe accused Longfellow of heresy of didactic, writing poetry that was preachy, derivative, and thematically plagiarized. Poe characteristically predicted that Longfellow's reputation and style of poetry would decline. Poe said, "We grant him high quality, but deny him the future." Like many famous artists, Poe's works have spawned imitators. Clairvoyants or psychics have claimed to channel Poe from Poe's spirit. One of the most notable was Lizzie Doughton, who published Poe's From the Inner Life in 1863, in which she claimed to have received new compositions from Poe's spirit. The historical Edgar Allan Poe has appeared as a physical character, often in order to represent the mad genius or tormented artist, to exploit his personal struggles. Many such depictions also blend in with characters from his stories, suggesting that Poe and his characters shared identities. Often, fictional depictions of Poe uses mystery-solving skills in such novels as The Poe Shadow by Matthew Pearl. In 2014, fundraising was completed for construction of a permanent memorial sculpture known as Poe Returning to Boston. The winning design by Stephanie Rockneck depicts a life-size Poe striding against the wind, accompanied by a flying raven. His suitcase lid has fallen open, leaving a paper trail of literary works that are embedded in the sidewalk behind him. When Edgar Allan Poe died in 1849, he was originally buried in an unmarked grave. When the grave was in danger of disappearing into the weeds, George W. Spencer undertook marking the spot with a sandstone marker, not with the famous writer's name, but with the number 80 that nobody can explain today. Why 80? As stories of the unkempt grave began to circulate throughout Baltimore, pressure grew to remedy the situation. Edgar's cousin Nielsen decided to order a proper marble headstone, and he also promised he would maintain the grave. While it was under construction, the stone was destroyed in a freak train accident when a freight car jumped the tracks and slammed into the graveyard. They never ordered another grave marker. The original stone only survives today because of sketches that were done as it was being created. It took many years before a proper stone for the poet and author was erected to mark his passing. Donations were collected for years, and half of the cost was paid for by George Childs in 1874. The monument was designed by George Frederick, the architect who had designed Baltimore's City Hall. The the grave marker shows Poe's birthday was January 20th instead of the 19th. Well, that was just one of those things. They can't change it now. The monument was too big to be placed in the original burial site, so they moved it to the front of the cemetery. Then they had to dig up Edgar Allan Poe's body and move it to where his tombstone was. They also put his aunt and his cousin in the same grave. 1913, another stone was laid to commemorate the original location of his internment. However, it was put in the wrong location. They've moved it several times, trying to figure out exactly where Edgar Allan Poe had originally been buried, and they haven't gotten it right yet. Between 1949 and 2009, a bottle of cognac and 3 roses were left at Poe's grave marker every January 19th by an unknown visitor who affectionately became known as the Poe Toaster. Poe died at age 40 in Baltimore, October 7th, 1849, under mysterious circumstances. The Poe toaster tradition may have begun in the 1930s, according to some witnesses. The unknown visitor continued showing up annually until 2009. Each year, in the early mornings of the morning of January 19th, Poe's birthday, a black clad figure carrying a silver tipped cane, his face covered by a scarf, would enter the Westminster Hall and Burial Ground in Baltimore. The visitor would pour a glass of Martell cognac and raise a toast. He then arranged 3 red roses on the monument in a distinctive configuration, and then he left, leaving the unfinished bottle of cognac behind. The roses were believed to represent Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother in law Maria Clem, all 3 who were originally interred at the site. The significance of the cognac is uncertain, as it does not feature in any of Poe's works. A note left at the 2004 visitation suggested that cognac may have represented a tradition in the Toasters family rather than Poe's. Many of the cognac bottles are kept at the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum in Baltimore. On several occasions, the toaster left a note along with the roses and cognac. Some notes were simple expressions of devotion, such as, Edgar, I haven't forgotten you. In 1993, a cryptic message stated, The torch will be passed. In 1999, a note announced that the original toaster had died the previous year and had passed the tradition on to a son. Subsequent eyewitnesses noted that the toaster appeared to be a younger individual. Spectators who show up to watch the toe poster each year uh, said that nobody has ever attempted to find out who he was or how he got into and out of the cemetery. Nobody wanted to go look. It's one of these traditions. They were there not to solve the mystery, but to partake in it. Anybody that did attempt to interfere with the post toaster was run off by the faithful watchers. In 2010, the Poe toaster failed to appear. The 2009 bicentennial of Poe's birth would make a logical ending point. He had been toasted for 100 years. In 2015, the Maryland Historical Society organized a competition to select a new individual to resurrect the annual tribute in a modified, tourism friendly form. The new toaster, who will also remain anonymous, made his first appearance during the daylight hours of January 16th, 2016, 3 days before Poe's birthday. I say no. The Poe toaster was somebody who was devoted to the writer and poet. This is not some touristy event, but a tribute to the man who invented so many of our writing genres today. We should just leave the ritual alone. The mystery of the Poe toaster was featured in an episode of Creepy Canada, along with the circumstances that led up to Poe's death and rumors that his ghost is haunting the West Hall and Burial Grounds today. It is believed that only 20 copies have survived of Poe's first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems. In December 2009, one copy sold at Christie's Auctioneer in New York for $662,500, a record price for any work of American literature. You know, Poe could have used some of that money, but he was never able to sell any of his books for any kind of big money. If the name Tamerlane rings a bell, but you just can't put your thumb on it, it's because he's the guy that said, When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble. Whoever opens my tomb will unleash an invader far more terrible than I. Russian scientists opened his grave just days before Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa. Many people theorize that it's because Tamerlane's grave was opened that Germany attacked Russia. When I was young, we would stay up late into the morning hours watching old horror movies. Some were not worth seeing, but that's what we did. On several nights, movies were shown with titles like The Pit and the Pendulum, Fall of the House of Usher, The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and The Haunted Palace. All of these movies were based on stories written by Poe. This led to me looking for and reading these stories and many more. I was considered a weird kid, and now I guess I'm a weird old guy. You can also buy a toaster, a bread toaster that will put the image of Poe on your toast. And yes, it is called a Poe toaster. I hope you enjoyed I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends, tell your relatives, tell people you don't even like or know. Tell them they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Until next Saturday, this is me. And don't forget about the baby fly.